So what if Amy's frisbee is melting? A frisbee can be replaced, a life cannot. Amy gave Jimmy foolish advice, but Jimmy went along with it and got himself killed by lethal electricity, silly lad. If Amy was my sister and we lost our frisbee in a substation and Amy said go on get it, I would say, Amy, for goodness sake woman, the frisbee is in an electrical substation full of dangerous live electrical apparatus. If we go in there we will get a fatal electric shock. Amy, we will buy another frisbee. The girl is not Alicia, she's called Amy, and Amy is a foolish girl, saying to Jimmy, presumably her brother, go on get it, when the frisbee goes into the substation and gets lodged on an insulator. Jimmy is daft enough to go into the substation and get fatally electrocuted, silly boy. Amy was very traumatized in billions of ways. Losing a frisbee is not worth losing sleep over. Jimmy died and Amy screamed in horror, poor girl. I say, when I saw the ad where Amy and Jimmy were playing near the electrical substation and the frisbee went into the substation and got lodged on an insulator and Amy said to Jimmy, go on get it. I was around the age of 12 or 13 and I was never scared or freaked out by this ad. In fact, this ad taught me vital lessons. Do not play near substations or electric pylons with frisbees or toys of any type. Amy and Jimmy should have bought another frisbee, not tried to retrieve that frisbee. Amy is not a snotty little cow, you silly boy. Amy is a foolish girl saying to her brother, Jimmy, go on get it. But Jimmy is an even sillier lad to go into the electrical substation to retrieve Amy's frisbee. What you are inferring is Amy is a murderer. You cannot say that really. Amy is a thoughtless girl, but not a murderer. Your emphasis on Amy is totally wrong, matey. Amy, the young girl in the substation advert, is a very foolish girl, saying to Jimmy, her brother, go on get it, but Jimmy is daft enough to go into the electrical substation and get himself fatally electrocuted and burnt to toast. Amy was no doubt very traumatized over Jimmy's death, and she could have committed suicide as a result of the trauma of Jimmy's death, poor Amy. The girl who screams Jimmy is called Amy. Amy is a foolish girl and she says to Jimmy, go on get it, which is daft. But Jimmy's daft enough to go into the substation and get fatally electrocuted, silly lad. I agree, Amy has perfect teeth for whatever age she was at the time this film was made. I would imagine Amy, aka Jane Totman, is now out of the acting profession, and she is probably running a pub or a restaurant. Who knows where Amy is nowadays? Amy is a very foolish girl, but Jimmy is an even dafter lad to go into the electrical substation and get a fatal electric shock. If Jimmy had said to Amy, bollocks, you go then, he would have been giving the same foolish advice to Amy as Amy gave to Jimmy. It would not solve anything at all. Amy was a very foolish girl saying to Jimmy, go on get it, but Jimmy was an even sillier lad to actively go into the substation for Amy's frisbee and get himself electrocuted. Jimmy was a silly lad. He went into the substation and Amy's urging him by saying, go on get it, and Jimmy was foolish enough not to say to Amy, Amy, do not be so silly, woman. We must not go into substations. They are downright dangerous, woman. Jimmy, as I see him, was not trying to impress Amy. He was being a silly lad, and he got fatally electrocuted and burnt to toast. Amy, Jimmy's, was a very foolish girl when she said go on get it, but Jimmy was an even sillier lad to go into the substation. Imagine if there were substations with 33,000 billion volts, or 30,000 billion volts, or even 33,000 billion volts. The voltage would not only kill the victim outright like the 33,000 volts one did, it would also vaporize the victim into ash and dust. Amy is a very foolish girl and gives her brother Jimmy foolish advice to go into an electrical substation to retrieve her frisbee, and Jimmy gets a lethal electric shock, silly lad. Amy is a very foolish girl saying to her brother Jimmy, go on, get it, and Jimmy is daft enough to go into the substation and get a fatal electric shock, silly boy. Amy, the girl in the PSA Play Safe Frisbee, is the sister of Jimmy, and Amy gives Jimmy very foolish advice saying go on, get it, but Jimmy is the one daft enough to go into an electrical substation to retrieve Amy's frisbee, silly lad, and Jimmy ends up dead and burnt to toast. Don't be silly, being electrocuted in substations is not cool, and Amy and Jimmy were foolish enough to play near a substation with the frisbee. Amy said to Jimmy, her brother, go on, get it. He was daft enough to go into the substation and get a fatal electric shock, silly lad. So do I, mate. I particularly remember the ad where Amy and Jimmy play frisbee near an electrical substation, and the frisbee goes into the substation, and Amy says to Jimmy, go on, get it, and Jimmy is daft enough to go into the substation to retrieve Amy's frisbee, and he gets a fatal electric shock and dies, and is also burnt to toast, silly lad. That is the price people pay if they mess around with lethal electricity. They will end up dead and burnt toast, silly fools, but there you are. I remember the ad where Jimmy goes into the electrical substation was shown in the early 80s on television during the school holidays, about 10:30 a.m, and I was never freaked out by this ad, but I learned to stay out of electrical substations. I also learned that if toys go into substations, do not try to retrieve them yourself, or else you will end up dead. The girl who screams Jimmy is called Amy, and Amy is a very foolish girl for saying Jimmy, giving Jimmy silly advice, but Jimmy does nothing to resist it. Amy, poor girl, witnesses Jimmy dying and screams Jimmy because she is witnessing her brother being fatally electrocuted. Poor Amy. Jimmy is daft enough to go into the electrical substation at Amy, his sister's foolish nagging, but Amy is not a snotty little cow at all. Amy is a very foolish girl, I admit that, but Jimmy is daft enough to go into the electrical substation to retrieve the frisbee, and he gets a lethal electric shock, stupid boy. Jimmy was daft enough to go into the substation on Amy, his sister's silly advice, but Jimmy did nothing to resist Amy's silly advice. He got a lethal electric shock and died, poor lad. Jimmy is silly enough to go into an electrical substation, and Amy, his sister, when she sees Jimmy fatally electrocuted, screams in horror, poor girl. The girl Amy gave Jimmy silly advice, but he was daft enough to go into the substation and get himself fatally electrocuted, silly lad.